Good evening. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this very special presentation. Tonight, we are marking the 80th anniversary of the Great Action in the Warsaw Ghetto. This was the action that saw the destruction of the Jewish community of Warsaw, began on July 22nd, and over approximately 2 months, over 250,000 Warsaw Jews were deported, and another 35,000 were killed within the confines of the ghetto. As we pause tonight to remember this action and this moment in Holocaust history, I always like to remind our learners that it's the ghettos that sees the last moment of Jewish communal life and Jewish family structure. And it's a really profound moment to think about how these people experienced the end of a culture, the end of their communal society. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce MCHE's historian and director of education, Dr. Shelley Klein, who's going to introduce our presenter tonight. Shelley is a gifted educator and my colleague of 6 years. And she's going to not only introduce Fran, but she's going to then come back at the end of our program to moderate questions. So as you think of things during our presentation tonight, please pop your question into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And Shelley will be back with those questions at the end of our program. Shelley?
Thank you, Jessica. It is indeed my honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Frances Sternberg recently retired from the University of Kansas Jewish Studies program, where she taught a variety of courses. Her research interests are in the 19th and 20th century East European Jewry, interwar Polish Jewry, the shtetl, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. She was the previous historian for the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, and in 2021, she participated in our Auschwitz speaker series, where she gave 2 presentations, one of which, Visualizing Genocide, about the Auschwitz album, had an incredible viewership of 21,704 views on our YouTube channel, making it by far the highest viewed program in the entire speaker series of world-renowned Holocaust scholars. So if you haven't seen that talk, I highly encourage you to check it out on our website as well. Dr. Sternberg is my dear friend, my mentor, and it is my pleasure to welcome her this evening. Dr. Sternberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you, Jessica. And thank you, Shelley, for that wonderful introduction. I'm honored, as always, to be part of any of your speaking programs. I was very honored to be the first person to present for the Auschwitz exhibit series, and I'm very honored to do this talk tonight. And I hope that it will prove useful and valuable to the people, to all of you who've come, and thank you for coming as well. Now I'm going to proceed to try to share my screen. Hopefully that will work, and Jessica or Shelley will tell me if it isn't sharing. So here we go. It is sharing? How's that?
Yes, looks good.
Let me just hide the floating controls. Okay, there we are. Now, I've called this presentation Dire Days, and you'll see why in a moment. And the subtitle, Grossaktion Warschau. Grossaktion means big operation, and the deportation and destruction of Warsaw's Jews. Now, the next couple of slides will introduce some of the material and some things I want everybody to think about prior to my going into the actual history of the event. Just a minute. Okay, so we'll start with the prologue, and I've called it Churban. Now, Churban is a Yiddish translation or a Yiddishization, which is the language many of the Jews in Poland spoke, whether they were traditionally Orthodox or not. It was very much the lingua franca and one of the official languages of Polish Jewry. Churban is the Yiddishization, if you will, the Yiddish transliteration of Korban. And Korban refers very specifically, it means destruction, but it refers specifically in Jewish liturgy to the destruction of the 2 temples, the 2 holy temples in Jerusalem. And you'll see why this is apt in a moment. Now, basically, Let me just move my picture out of the way a bit. The big action, this deportation action of Warsaw's Jews to Treblinka II, started on Erev Tisha B'Av. Now, Tisha B'Av means the 9th day of the month of Av. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's the Jewish calendar. And that's traditionally the date, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, when the temples, both temples, first and second, each in their turn, were destroyed. According to tradition, one by the Babylonians and one by the Romans. And so the big action started on Wednesday, July 22nd, the eve of Tisha B'Av, Erev Tisha B'Av, and ended, interestingly enough, on September 21st, which was Yom Kippur. So we are now essentially in the season of the big action. So 80 years ago, in this season that we are literally in right now, between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, this is when the big action took place. And I've used the quote here to introduce this from Lamentations, the book of Eicha, which is the book that is traditionally read on Tisha B'Av, and it basically refers to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so the quote is an interesting one because of the word dire. How alone sits the great city of many inhabitants, all her pursuers have entrapped her in dire straits. And this is very apt with respect to even how Jessica put this together for you in her introduction, because it is, the discussion here will have a lot to do with the destruction, not just of human life, but of cultural life as well. The Warsaw Ghetto looms very large in the Holocaust. It is the emblematic ghetto, and this big action is the emblematic deportation action. And you'll see how it fits into the Holocaust, I hope, the larger picture of the Holocaust as we go along. So again, the largest and most emblematic deportation and the largest and most emblematic of the ghettos. And it was very much an 8-week period of almost nonstop violence and terror in order to get 300,000, give or take, Jews to Treblinka. Now, before we even go into that aspect of it, I need to also share with you some perceptions. As I was putting this talk together, just doing random Googling, looking for big actions, seeing what would come up and seeing what kind of documents I could find, I kept running into a problem. And the problem was that everything, when I put in having to do with the Warsaw Ghetto, came up with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is not surprising. There is a kind of dichotomy that emerges in the perception of the Holocaust between what I call Shoah, meaning Holocaust, and Gevurah, meaning heroism. And this is no accident. Those of you are familiar with Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum and Research Facility in Jerusalem, know that it's called Yad Vashem for Shoah and Gevurah, for Holocaust and heroism. There's a kind of perception, of the Warsaw Ghetto and the mass of its Jewish inhabitants. And there's a very skewed representation of how they coped with their situation. And you can see it in exactly this very famous monument, which is both in Poland and in Warsaw and at Yad Vashem. And the monument is by Nathan Rappaport. It was done after the war, of course, to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And if you look at the monument, it's very interesting because what we have here are essentially a major portion of the monument, which jumps right out at you. And then you have to kind of get along to the side and you see, quote, the minor portion of the monument. The major portion is essentially Rappaport's detailing, Rappaport's representation, very heroic in scale, of Mordechai Anulewicz. Mordechai Anulewicz was the head of the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. We'll come to what that is in a moment as well. He was a young man in his late teens, early 20s. This is him right before the war. This is how Rappaport depicts him. Now, there's a sense here of not so much just the focus, but the size of the focus. We're looking at something very large. And then when you come to this part of it, on the very side here we come to the a portrayal of what they call, let me see what they call it here, the last march. This sort of is supposed to represent the deportations. And so there's an interesting sort of skewed representation, a very small group of armed responders, and I'll talk about armed response in a moment in the context of this kind of representation. And the mass of people are given a much smaller scale. So there's a mythos involved, the mythos of armed response, which in a sense overtakes and pulls our attention and our focus away from the mass experience of what happened to the mass of Jews. And so if you're looking for material on the great, even if you put in the big action, you're going to get a ton of stuff on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that was really striking to me. Now, the problem is this isn't just something that happened in the post-war period. In fact, there are two ways of looking at it. If you look at the various armed response organizations, both in the Vilna Ghetto and in the Warsaw Ghetto, you see the same kind of perception. Here we have the call to arms of Hashomer HaTzair and the Warsaw Ghetto newspaper. Hashomer HaTzair happens to be the Zionist group to which Mordechai Anulevitz belonged. And I've just pulled out some of a quote here for you. For generation upon generation, passivity and lack of faith in our own strength had pressed upon us. And then here comes something even more pointed from the United Partisan Organization, which is the armed response organization in the Vilna Ghetto, where Abba Kovner says, "We will not let them take us like animals to the slaughter, neither hiding nor cowardice." Notice that hiding and cowardice are put essentially as equals. There's parity between that. Will save lives. Brothers, it is better to fall in battle in the ghetto than to be led like sheep to Ponari, which is the site where they were shooting people as well. Now, this is one thing. Historians, and no less a historian than Roel Hilberg, has reiterated this in a much more, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to say distorted, but it's not as straightforward as it should be. He has an essay, which I have my students read when I taught the Holocaust, called 2,000 Years of Jewish Appeasement. And it comes from his book, The Destruction of the European Jews, his monumental opus about the Holocaust. And he is one of the great Holocaust historians, don't get me wrong, but he's not always right. Or he's not always as accurate or as, what shall I say, exact as he should be. He talks about the reaction pattern of Jews is characterized by almost complete lack of resistance. And by him, to him, resistance means only armed response. Not any other kind. And he outlines 5 types of Jewish response to their environment, the hostile environment that Jews were living in Europe for 2,000 years, as he calls it, 2,000 years of Jewish appeasement. And as far as he's concerned, they're all appeasement except for armed response. And he says the Jews were not oriented towards resistance because that was always the response they chose the least, because it was the least useful to keep the community going. Outbreaks of resistance were consequently, now he's talking about the Holocaust, infrequent, and almost always they were local occurrences that transpired at the last moment. He's absolutely correct, but his implication, his interpretation of that is problematic as far as I'm concerned. And this is all of this. Now, again, the young people who were involved in the actual armed response movements in the ghettos talked about this. But here we have another sense of this, because for Hilberg, this was really the only meaningful response. The idea that Jews were hiding, the idea that Jews were trying to bribe their way out of things, which are time-honored methods, the idea that even that they were complying with certain things to keep the rest of the community alive, that is beyond his willingness to give it the proper weight he should give it. For him, it is only armed response. Now, here we have a comment, the last comment here I want to share with you. Oh, I'm sorry, bear with me, this is not the one I wanted. I'll share that one with you. I'm sorry, I put in the wrong quote here. But what there's another quote I was going to share with you from Marek Edelman, who was the last surviving member of the command staff of the Jewish armed response, the Jewish fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what he writes, and I'll share it with you at the end of the presentation so you'll see it exactly, is, and he does this in after the war in a memoir, an interview memoir that he gave in the 1980s. And he makes a very interesting point. He says, well, in the Jewish fighting organization, there are only 200 of us. And the 200 of us had decided that because we are told by civilization that it's better to die with a gun in your hand than not, that we would die with guns in our hands. But he says it is only a choice as to the manner of dying. And here we have, essentially, that's reiterated by Abba Kovner in the Vilna Ghetto. Brothers, it is better to fall in battle in the ghetto than to be led like sheep. Now, my take on this is it's not much of a choice. You choose your way to die. And this is what Marek Edelman is saying. It's a choice as to the manner of dying. But let me go to the next slide and you'll see exactly what I mean. So here we have another way of looking at the mass of people and how they responded, especially as we're going to see this large deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. And that is that they were trying to stay alive. There's a Yiddish saying, "Asha gelebt is euch gelebt," an hour lived is also lived. And this is very much the feeling that you get. Asha gelebt is euch gelebt. And so what you have here is, for example, from the diary of Chaim Kaplan, on March 10th, 1940, he writes, "They love life and they do not wish to disappear from the earth before their time." They're choosing life, and the strength of this power is rooted in our eternal tradition that commands us to live. So it's not a kind of zero-sum game. You either shoot Germans or you go to your death like a coward. People were trying to stay alive. And what you're going to also see is they didn't really understand what was going on half the time, but that's going to be another story. And here's the other thing I find so touching. And this brings this all home to you. It comes from his entry on November 5th, 1940. The Jews have just been in the ghetto for a short period of time. And he talks about how crowded the conditions are. But this is what he focuses on. And again, this is what I mean by choiceless choices and by staying alive. The Jewish mothers have already gotten used to their bad fortune, and in order not to deprive their babies of the sunlight, they take their stand with their cradles wherever there is a square or a vacant lot or a sidewalk covered with sunlight. This is part of the tradition that commands us to live. And I'm not talking about a religious tradition. I'm talking about the whole tradition of Jewish response to these situations and how they respond. You respond by staying alive. And so I'm sharing with you these nice pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto of mothers just doing that with their children in the sunlight. And again, and here's the quote from Marek Edelman that I had for you. But even before I get to that, and I get to the quote here from Primo Levi, Lawrence Langer, in one of his essays, he studies this whole notion of people and how they respond, Jews, and how they responded to their situation in various ways. And he says, the Jews in the Holocaust were faced with what amounted to choiceless choices. Not life and death, but one abnormal response and another. The idea that taking up arms is going to solve something is not valid in the context of the fact that nothing was in the Jews' choosing. Their choices were essentially choiceless. The Germans held all the cards. And so again, here we have Marek Edelman's quote. I didn't realize I had it on this slide. And that is, it was only a choice as to the manner of dying. We didn't choose April 19th, the day the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began. The Germans chose it. Because that was the day they were going to come, as you're going to see, for the final liquidation of the ghetto after the big action, several months after the big action. And so we decided we would die with guns in our hands, but it was only a choice as to the manner of dying. And I submit to you, that's not much of a choice. So again, what we're doing here, and why am I going on about this? I think it's extremely important to understand that it's very easy to lose the sense of what was happening to the mass of Jews. And what I want to do is bring this back for you and give you a sense of the system in which, the systematic genocide in which these people were trapped. Now, one more little bit of prologue, and that is about Warsaw. As I often tell my students, I like to at least remind people before we see what becomes of them in the ghetto, and of course later on afterwards, what they were like before. Polish Jews was the second largest Jewish community in Europe, in the world, I'm sorry. They were 1/5 of the world's Jews, and Warsaw was the world's second largest Jewish city. And the Jews in Warsaw, and again, the numbers are very fungible. Were there 300,000, were there 350,000, were there 400,000 Jews? It kind of comes and goes in terms of numbers. But let's take the number 375,000. They were the world's second largest Jewish city, and they were almost 30% of the population of Warsaw. To give you a sense of context, France had only 400,000 Jews, all of France. And these are some pictures of Jews in the most Jewish sections of Warsaw. This is where they lived. And ironically, or not so ironically, the bulk of Jews, now Jews lived all over Warsaw, but the bulk of Jews, or the bulk of the Jewish institutions, you might say the core of Warsaw, was where the ghetto was going to be placed. And as you can see here, I have outlined, basically, you can see here is the ghetto, the shadowed area. And all of these little dots, these colored dots, and you can relate them to these colored dots basically tell you all the different kind of organizations that had their headquarters in the heart of this Jewish area that would also become the ghetto. So this was the Jewish area, the Jewish downtown, if you will. And the ghetto would be placed very much along that area. Although Jews, again, by this time were living all over the city. And in terms of what they did for a living, basically, they were mostly small-time operators. Many lived in, as you can see, many worked in workshops, factories, that kind of thing, mostly often just small workshops. Again, many were, another very large group were in commerce. And by commerce, I mean small shops, push carts, peddling and vending. And then a much smaller number were in the more white collar, if you will, sort of situations. This gives you another socio-occupational comparison between Christians and Jews in Warsaw, Jews and non-Jews, if you will. And you can see here too where the Jews are skewed. Now, they were a diverse group. Many of them were secular or secularizing. Orthodoxy had somewhat lost its hold, not completely. There are some generational issues here that I don't have the time to go into, but it was a very diverse community. Warsaw was central to all, as you saw from the little dots on the previous map, Warsaw was not just central to the Jewish community of Warsaw, but it was also central to all the self-help, the social service networks, all of the different religious and cultural institutions that worked, that had branches throughout the educational institutions that had branches throughout Poland. Much of Jewish life in Poland, in terms of Jewish institutional life, was networked and centered through Warsaw. And the Jews were quite secular. As I said, there's a large secular component. They were very involved in the creation of a distinctive Jewish secular culture, as well as making contributions to non-Jewish culture. Now, the other thing, of course, that you need to keep in mind, apart from Hitler and the Nazis and the Germans, whatever, is that Poland had a certain amount of anti-Semitism of its own. It's a complicated story, and it's not as, easy to simply parse, in a few words, but I tried to do this for you here. Certainly, from 35 on, anti-Semitism does escalate. There were quotas. There are quotas in the colleges and universities. Jewish shops are being boycotted. Jewish participation in professional aspects of the economy are restricted and so on and so forth. And there's even a certain amount of increased anti-Jewish violence, which also leads to a shift in the politicization of the Jewish community. The mainstream Zionists and the Agudas Yisrael, the non-Zionist Orthodox Jewish Party, politically, these are political groups as well, they tend to be losers in this heightened anti-Semitic situation because they are not inclined to activism in a real sense. The mainstream Zionists try to, they don't try to, they encourage a perception that Jews need to emigrate to Palestine, which was then, of course, the British mandate. But the chances for this, the actual chances, especially as the 30s go on, become, they become less and less a valid possibility. Agudas Yisrael, who, again, the Orthodox Jewish Party, which had a large following, even amongst secular Jews, who saw it as a kind of mediating influence, but essentially their ability to try to stay, in the good graces, to keep a sort of a good relationship with the authorities didn't seem to be working as well because the authorities were increasingly anti-Semitic. The gainers here are the militant groups, the revisionist Zionists, the radical right, the communists, the radical left, and the Bund, the Jewish socialists. They gain the most support. And you can see in the Warsaw municipal elections, which is to say to the city hall in Warsaw, you can see that the Bund has 60% of the Jewish vote. So now we come to why you're here. And I call this policy and procedure number 1, Lebensraum and Endlösung. Now, in order to understand the ghettos generally, and the Warsaw Ghetto specifically, we need to understand where they fit in German policy, in Nazi policy. That's not ideology. That's, a done deal. We're not talking about, Aryans or whatever here. We're talking more about, so in the scope of things, in the policies and programs of Hitler, the Nazis, Germany, where do they fit? Now, here we have to come to understanding that Germany is fighting 2 wars. And this is not my idea. This is Lucy Davidovich's idea. She calls her book, her magnum opus, The War Against the Jews. But in point of fact, Germany is fighting 2 wars, which is her point. A war of conquest for territory, for race and space, for what they call Lebensraum, and a war against the Jews. Endlösung, solving the Jewish problem. Endlösung means final solution. And the real key word here is Lösung, which means solution. So there's a war against the Jews to solve this perceived ideological Jewish problem. And there is, of course, a war of conquest to get space for this Aryan wonderland they plan to build. Okay. And what you can see, too, is that in terms of the war against the Jews, we're looking at what Raul Hilberg calls 3 solutions. So this solution to the Jewish problem changes over time. How we're going to solve the Jewish problem changes over time. The first solution he calls the limited solution. And this is the emigration solution. Until Germany actually enters the war, the goal of legislation, expulsion, which is to say throwing out the Jews who were Polish, Polish Jews born in Poland, but were living legally in Germany, but then they get thrown out. And violence, like the violence of Kristallnacht, these all have one goal. And the goal is to get Jews to leave Germany. And I'm talking about Germany, Austria, and the annexed Czech territories. So until September 39, this is the goal, what he calls the limited solution. Then, with the invasion of Poland, and latterly the invasion of the Soviet Union, we have what Hilberg calls situational solutions. 2 solutions, each tailored to address particular situations. And these are not final goals. Well, actually the one in the Soviet Union is pretty final. But the point is, these are goals tailored to address the issues, either ideological or demographic, having to do with Poland and the Soviet Union. And for Poland, it's ghettos. And for the Soviet Union, it's these mobile shooting squads called Einsatzgruppen. And the goals in the ghettos are to concentrate the Jews and to just let them go to waste by attrition. It's only later, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, as you're going to see, that a different solution is then floated and put together, which is systematic genocide having to do with the death camps. And the other thing you should notice, and you can see it here too, I've got you can see the expansion of territory. Each solution, as Christopher Browning says, becomes more radical, more extreme as the Germans gain more territory. Let me show it to you in a different way. So again, the policy becomes more extreme in response to three factors. The extent to which Germans achieve their diplomatic and military goals, the extent to which Germany, the expansion of the territory under German control, the extent to which the territory under German control expands, and the size of the Jewish population expands, all of these will basically lead to a more radical solution. So you can see here, for example, you can see here with the invasion of Poland, which are so many more Jews than there are in Germany. There were only 500,000 Jews in Germany to start with, and after Kristallnacht, there were only 250,000 because half of them left or had left by then. And so we're going from Germany, even if you factor in Austria and Czechoslovakia, you're still not looking at anything like the Jewish population of Poland. And so there is where the solution becomes more radical. When you look at the Soviet Union, other ideological factors come into it too. And then we're looking at even more radical solution, and there's so much more territory. And then finally, once Europe is completely locked in, the Germans call it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, then you come to this notion of systematic genocide. So Poland is invaded on September 1st, 1939, and very shortly, Poland falls. And as you know, or if you don't know, I've mentioned it here, as a consequence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the German-Soviet pact of neutrality, if you will, that was signed a week before the war starts. When the Germans move into Poland, the Soviet Union, in order to keep the Soviet Union from declaring war on Germany and giving the Germans much more to deal with, and for the Soviets, it allowed them to buy some time because they weren't truly prepared to fight the Germans yet. Basically, the Soviet Union is given a certain amount of territory. So Poland, once it falls, is divided in three. And so one portion becomes, and this is an important word because I'll be repeating it a lot, so I hope you'll remember it. One portion, number one here, is called the general government, or the general gouvernement, but I'm going to call it the general government. And it's central Poland. It becomes essentially an occupied zone, occupied by Germany. It has a general governor, Hans Frank, and that is a military and German military and civil occupation area. One section, this section here, number 2, which includes Silesia, Silesia and the Wartegau, the area to the north, so Western Poland, is annexed directly into Germany and ceases to exist altogether. It becomes essentially part of the Greater Reich, Germany. So it becomes German territory. And then we have the section annexed to the Soviet Union that is given over to the Soviet Union. Now, today we'll be largely concerned with this region because that's where Warsaw is. Although interestingly enough, the region is not governed from Warsaw, it is governed from Krakow, which is where the civilian authority is, which is to say Hans Frank, and also from Lublin, where the SS is, under Odilo Globocnik. That's your situation. So now we come to the ghettos and the Jewish question, another aspect of policy and procedure. So where do the ghettos fit in all this? What is the point of the ghettos? Judenfrage means the Jewish question. The solution to the Jewish question is the Endlösung, the final solution. So how do the ghettos figure in these solutions? Now, Even, interestingly enough, before the war starts, in November of 38, right after Kristallnacht, there is a meeting called, literally in the wake of Kristallnacht, Hitler calls a meeting. Actually, Hitler doesn't call a meeting. Hitler asks Goering to call a meeting. And Goering calls a meeting of various authorities who will be involved or are already involved in various aspects of the German economy, and also various aspects of policing Germany, which is to say the SS, who will have something to do with the Jews. Goering is head of, for a while, this whole, Goering is made, because he is the plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, which is an economic development plan, he is also given the job of solving the Jewish problem. That's what Hitler tells him. So that's why he calls this meeting on November 12th. And at this meeting, a number of people come, important amongst whom are Reinhard Heydrich, who is head of the Reich Security Main Office, which is one of the major offices in the SS. Also, another person whose picture is not here is Kurt de Leuge, who is head of the Ordnungspolizei, another major SS office, because they are going to be involved in Jewish policy, implementing Jewish policy. And then all kinds of economic honchos are there too, because they are there because the Jews are seen still as an economic problem, i.e. we want the Jews gone, but we want to keep their money. In any case, there's a very interesting discussion in these minutes, and I pulled the minutes out for you, where they talk about, now we got all these Jews in Germany, what are we going to do with them until they leave? You know, we want them to go until we can get them out of here. We can force them to leave. We can force them to emigrate. And trust me, after Kristallnacht, they're all trying to emigrate like crazy. So what do we do with them in the meantime? There's always this, like, what do we do? You know, how do we do this? We have this sort of temporary situation. How do we deal with it? And Heydrich says to Goering, and these are like the minutes of the meeting, Heydrich says to Goering, somehow we should look at some kind of badge or something. Well, Goering, of course, thinks a uniform because he liked uniforms. But no, Heydrich says, no, a badge. We need to know who the Jews are. The other thing, too, is Goering raises this issue seemingly out of the blue. That's nice. We can give them badges. OK, and then we'll know who the Jews are so we can keep tabs on them. But we're still going to have a ghetto. We have, cities, particularly Berlin comes to mind, Frankfurt, Hamburg, with large Jewish populations, nothing like Warsaw or Łódź or any of the other, or Krakow or any of the Polish towns, but still we got these big, Jewish populations. And we need to put them in ghettos so we can keep tabs on them till they go. And Heydrich says that would be nice, as he says, for the matter of ghettos. I would like to make my position clear. From a police point of view, we just don't have the manpower. Later, they'll get the manpower, but they're going to have to rethink how they get it. But at this point, they're not there yet. So he's saying we can't do ghettos. Good idea, but we can't do it because we can't police them. So we'll leave it. This is an interesting, comment on how they perceive non-Jewish Germans or German non-Jews. We'll just leave them out amongst their neighbors, and their neighbors will keep an eye on them, keep tabs on them. And ironically, German Jews don't wear badges either until much later. Okay, that's where it appears. But so that they kind of float that balloon, but it's not, not something they accept. Fast forward now to the war, to the beginning of the war, to the conquest of Poland, and it's a whole other situation. And this is where we come to these two situational solutions. And the first one, because the Soviet Union is not going to be invaded until June of 41. But in 39, ghettos become the solution, the situational solution to the Jewish problem in Poland. And you can see again here, this is a nice depiction of the difference in the population sizes. You get a sense of how few Jews there are in Western and Central Europe compared to the vast numbers of Jews in the Soviet Union and in Poland. And again, these figures are very fungible, give or take here. All right, so Poland is invaded, Poland falls. Not 3 weeks into the invasion of Poland, here is Heydrich. Now they figured out how they're going to deal with the Jews in Poland. And notice what he says. This is one of the most interesting documents in the Holocaust. If I could teach the Holocaust for 4 documents, this would be one of them. Instructions by General Heydrich on policy and operations concerning Jews in the occupied territories. By the way, what I've done when I find a name, when I'm introducing a name, I've always given the birth and death dates. And the reason I do that is I want to give you a sense of how young these people were. Heydrich was only born in 1904, and this is 1939. You do the math. These are young men. This is a young generation, the young generation making its mark in all of these situations. And you keep, being sensitive to the dates because they're fascinating. So he is writing this to the chiefs of all Einsatzgruppen of the security police. The Einsatzgruppen are, and they'll later get further beefed up, these are groups that have been recruited or trained to do essentially military style work, which is to say assassination, arrest, not so much military, but police/military style work, military police work, what do you want to call it? Police state work, political police work would be a good term. Sort of parallel to what the Wehrmacht does with respect to real military stuff. And the Einsatzgruppen are the shock troops. And they're all under Heydrich's purview, or a lot of them are, under Heydrich's purview in the Reich Security main office, because he's head of it. The SS has 12 offices, of which 2, one the RSHA, one the Ordnungspolizei, are very important in this whole discussion. So these are very important offices in the SS. And what he says, this is a memo, a Schnellbrief, like a telegram. And this is a typical sort of military, I guess today it'd be an email. But here we have, so he's sending it to the chiefs of all the Einsatzgruppen of the Sicherheitspolizei, which is one of the 3 or 4 different police groups that are in the Reich Security main office. And I refer to the conference held in Berlin today, and notice who attended them, everybody involved in the Jewish question. And again, point out that the plan took total measures, the final aim, are to be kept strictly secret. Distinction must be made between the final aim, which we don't yet know, and the stages leading to the final aim, which we're going to start thinking about now. So what he is saying is we are planning a kind of temporary policy, absent coming up with a more final solution, just to deal with the Jews in Poland, in these conquered Polish territories. And the first perquisite, because we don't know yet where this is going to go, this is just temporary, is the concentration of Jews from the countryside into the larger cities. That we're going to do that post haste. And in each Jewish community, we're going to have a council of elders, which are going to be called Judenräte or Judenrat, singular, to be set up to assist us in administrating this. And basically, and notice here too, he says the council is to be made fully responsible in the literal sense of the word, which is to say with their lives for the exact and prompt implementation of directives that we are issuing. And again, they're talking about, and he talks about this here, the concentration of Jews in ghettos, or what they call Jüdische Wohnbezirke, Jewish neighborhoods. And at the meeting that he refers to, we met in Berlin, and here's like, a summary of what we talked about. At the meeting, he says the Jews are to be concentrated in ghettos, in cities, in order to facilitate a better possibility of control and later expulsion. So again, the ghettos are a situational solution, temporary in the sense that we don't yet have a final goal. We haven't figured out what we're really going to do with all the Jews. So this is sent out, and it's a very informal thing. It's not like you're going to do this, 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 and this. What he sketches out here is what's important. We're going to have ghettos. You figure that one out. We're going to have a Jewish council. They're going to be responsible ultimately with their lives for helping us run this stuff, for implementing our decisions. And this is the Schnellbrief. So essentially what he outlines here are the expulsion of Jews from the parts of Poland incorporated to the Reich, the transfer of Jews into the interior of Poland, the concentration of Jews already in the interior, i.e. in the general government, into larger concentrated areas, the dissolution of Jewish communities, and the administration of these communities that they set up by a council of elders, a Judenrat. And so here I have two different maps of ghettos to give you a sense of their proliferation. And so you have here the timing and geography, and you will see that the bulk of the ghettos, the first ghettos are located in the general government. That should be, I'm sorry, that should be number 2, yes. And in the annexed territories in Poland, it should be this way, it should be 1 and 2. So here are the annexed territories, and here's the general government. And then after the invasion of the Soviet Union, some ghettos are established in the conquered Soviet territories, but often those are established only after Jews have been killed by Einsatzgruppen, and sometimes in conjunction with those murders. So we're not going to worry about those too much. The ghettos we're concerned with are here and limitedly here. Give you a sense too of demographic size, and you have a sense here of the ghettos in terms of which are larger and which are smaller. Here they give a figure of the Warsaw ghetto, biggest dot of all, 500,000 people. Well, again, that figure comes up all the time too. Everybody uses a variety of figures. One of the reasons that it's not because people are lying about the numbers, it's because it's really very hard to figure out all the numbers. The different ways of counting Jews come up against the advance of armies and the shifting of borders, and it becomes very problematic. But the largest ghettos are in Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, Lublin, Częstochowa, and Lviv in Ukraine. And in the USSR, I have some as well. Now, so the Warsaw Ghetto. Certainly the largest ghetto the Germans have to cope with. And it's established in 1940. And so what we have is there's a young man, I don't have a picture of him, unfortunately, Waldemar Schoen, who is the head of resettlement in the Warsaw district. And early in 1940, he already begins drafting plans for ghettoizing Warsaw's Jews. For a while, he has certain plans, they don't always agree with them. He had decided to make 2 ghettos in Warsaw. He has all kinds of, interesting ideas. And in the end, they're not eager to do this in terms of 2 ghettos, but they definitely decide on 1, and they use his plans for one of those ghettos. So on September 12th, Governor General Hans Frank approved of one of his plans. And on Erev Rosh Hashanah, they issue the order to establish the ghetto. And on Yom Kippur, the order is announced. And Adam Chernyakov, who is head of the Judenrat, and we'll come to him in a moment, he's told of the order, and he's given a map of the ghetto. And sound trucks go all over Warsaw, notifying the inhabitants of what's going on. And then everybody moves into the ghetto, and on Friday, November 15th, 1940, the ghetto is sealed, which means that it's walled off. And all the Jews have to be there by that date. And what I have here for you, again, is a document, because again, why are there so many documents and so few pictures? Because we're looking at a bureaucratic process. And what you have in any bureaucracy is a paper trail. And the paper trail is pure gold, because you get everything they're thinking, because they're communicating with each other. These are not propaganda pieces. This is what they are thinking and doing in real time. So you have here, and this is from Ludwig Fischer. Again, note how young, 1905, not an old man at all. He talks about the establishment of a ghetto in Warsaw, and there are regulations having to do with restrictions and residence in the general government that have to be observed. The Jewish quarter is going to be formed in the city of Warsaw. Jews have to move there, and they must take up residence. It's going to be set off from the rest of the city. There's a list of streets that they give. Poles cannot move into the German quarter, but Poles also cannot live in the Jewish quarter, which means that Poles are also displaced from their homes, moved elsewhere in the city in order for the Jews, all the Jews from the rest of Warsaw, to be moved into the ghetto. Jews living outside the Jewish quarter have to move in by October 31st, and they can only take a certain amount of luggage, refugee luggage, they call it, which are like backpacks, bed linen, that kind of things. And again, the Jewish elder, meaning the Judenrat Ältester, the head of the Judenrat, will be seeing to the disposition of dwellings and so on. And here we have another young man, a quote from, and this is Ludwig Fischer, the young man who gave this order that I just read to you. And here we have a quote from Valdemar Schoen, the young man who designed the ghetto, basically. What is he saying? We want to show the world that we are able to cope with the Jewish problem. We can do it. We're going to show them how well we do it. Now, there's an administration. Hans Frank issues an order that Judenräte are to be established in all the general government, in all the ghettos and in all the communities of the general government, and then it follows, they're going to go into the ghettos. And so here is again, another piece of the paper trail. There's always a paper. There's a paper for that. Regulation of the establishment of the Judenrat, Sunday, November 28th, 1939. I put in the days of the week. Again, to me, I love knowing when things happen. As a historian, I love that notion of as exact a chronology as I can get. And so I like to know what day of the week, these people are busy, Sunday. And so they're talking about here, there's going to be body representing in each community, the representatives of the Jews. There will be, then the Judenrat being picked will elect a chairman and a deputy from among its members, yada, yada. It is the duty of the Judenrat through its chairman or his deputy to receive the orders of the German administration. It is responsible for the conscientious carrying out of orders to their full extent. Now understand, this is their job. They carry out German orders. And remember what Heydrich said, they're responsible in the most extreme way. And its directives, because they come from the Germans, have to be obeyed by everybody. And so here we have Reinhard Heydrich's Schnellbrief. I brought this up because I wanted to show you how this, from Hans Frank, basically elaborates on what Heydrich says in his Schnellbrief. They're to make personally responsible for the departure of Jews from the countryside and personally responsible in the most literal way. And here is a meeting of the officers from the Warsaw SSSD, the Warsaw Command and General and Police Staff in Warsaw, meeting with the Warsaw Judenrat for the first time. And the arrow, here's Adam Chernyakov. And next to him are some of the 24 members of the Judenrat. And this was in the Jewish Community Building, which will also become the Judenrat headquarters. Again, it's right in that, it was the Jewish community. It used to be the Kehillah, like the Jewish Community Center with the whole Jewish municipal government in Warsaw. That building, which is right in the ghetto, or is in the Jewish neighborhood and now is right in the ghetto, will be the headquarters for the Judenrat. So here you have a picture. Now, a little bit about Adam Chernyakov, because he's going to figure very largely in what comes subsequently. So Adam Chernyakov was not a member of the Jewish community in the sense that he was involved in vast numbers of Jewish communal organizations or anything like that. He was very much a person who had, he was educated. He had an engineering degree. He taught in the Jewish Community's vocational school in Warsaw. So he was known in the community, but not a known quantity as a community leader. He was on the Warsaw Municipal Council, which means he worked in the city hall, or he was elected to the city hall. He was also in the upper house of the Polish parliament. But notice, again, he's a secular figure. And shortly after Warsaw surrendered, he becomes head of the Judenrat. And his job, as I said, is basically to follow and implement German directives. Now, in addition, because Warsaw, like Łódź, is such a big city, its Judenrat also has to address certain municipal issues, as it were. If they have budgetary difficulties, they have to deal with housing and welfare, they have to deal with food distribution, all kinds of stuff. And they have to keep, various Jewish groups, satisfied that things are being done. There's both an up and a downside to him. Every Judenrat head is different. You can do studies of them. And he's a real interesting person. He very much tried to, as much as he could, keep the Germans from intervening as much as possible in the ghetto. Obviously, that was a losing task. Certainly, in terms of the food shortage and so on, he did try to support smuggling operations and getting all kinds of materials into the ghetto. As you will see, the food situation is, you know, epidemic of starvation. And he also, when he could, encouraged a variety of clandestine social responses, which is to say support of clandestine educational and cultural activities and vocational activities. And many ghettos, this differs from ghetto to ghetto, but in Warsaw, synagogues are outlawed, schools are outlawed, and a lot of this had to go underground. Now, in terms of, again, an aspect, like I said, the goal here is concentration and attrition. Concentration, the ghetto is abysmally small. It is about 1.5 square miles, 995 acres. It's 2.4% of the city's land mass, which is going to be holding 30% of the city's population. You do the math. So basically, we're looking at 7 persons per room. The thing about the neighborhoods in which many of these houses are located in the Warsaw Ghetto is that this was always sort of a tenement area. Even though the Jewish institutions were there, the better people have moved out of this area, and many of the Jews living in what was, would become the ghetto were living in poor tenements, as you're going to see. And so it's a very fraught situation. Now, in terms of population, I've got some figures here. It shows how many non-Jews are displaced. It shows how many inhabitants, come into the ghetto. And it gives you a sense of how overcrowded the ghetto is. Just to give you a comparison, I found some figures the other day. Kansas City, Missouri in 2020, and I'm talking about the actual city limits. I'm not talking about the metro area. The actual city limits are 319 square miles, as opposed to 1.5 square miles. And the population, this is 2020, was the figure I got from Britannica, was 459,717. Now, again, you do the math. It's an abysmal, overcrowded situation. So we're talking about concentration. We're talking not just about concentration, getting everybody in one place, but shoving them into an incredibly small and difficult place. Here's a better map of the Warsaw Ghetto. Gives you a sense of what it looked like. There were 2 ghettos in effect. There's a little ghetto called the small ghetto and the large ghetto. They are here. Let me see, right there. At Cholodna and Zalazna streets, they are separated here. And the reason they're separated is because there's literally 2 sections to the ghetto. And to get from one to the other, you have to cross a street that is not in the ghetto, is because a streetcar goes through it. See, there's a streetcar. And so at first, what they had were Jewish police. And by the way, there's a Jewish police force that also becomes part of the implementation of German orders. Technically, it's beholden to the Judenrat, but it isn't really. Hey, they follow the German orders. There would be a Jewish policeman and possibly a German policeman of some kind, usually some, German auxiliary, whatever, making sure people cross the street. But then they built this footbridge because it was separated by walls. So they built this footbridge. And by the way, here's a picture of Jewish workers building the wall. And the other thing you should notice when you look at these pictures, and they pay, looking at them is quite an interesting activity. What you should notice are other things, like the pedestrians on the other side of the wall walking by. And here, under the footbridge, now, this is a pretty, excuse me a minute. What's interesting here is this is a pretty, what shall I say, not as overcrowded as some of the pictures I've come across, but I wanted to give you a sense of how this footbridge spans the 2 ghettos. And here is the rail yard that will become the place that everybody leaves from for Treblinka. Now, the other thing has to do with attrition. And attrition is essentially letting Jews die by wasting away. They let the community literally waste away. And here is a report by Auerswald, who is the commissar of the Warsaw Ghetto. So he's the civilian commissar of the Warsaw Ghetto. He's an SS Untersturmführer, but he acts in a kind of civilian capacity. And he writes here, this is a report he makes, the three most important problems in connection with the Jewish quarter were and are the food situation, health, and economy. And he goes on to talk about, and this is a really fulsome, and fulsome means foolish, and not foolish in a silly way, but it's a kind of fantasy report. He's essentially saying, it looks like things are getting better. They're not. But he has figures in terms of how many people are dying per month. January 898, February 1023. Look at this, the numbers escalate. By August 1941, they're at 5,500 a month. And he's also talking about disease. So he outlines here exactly what's going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. He makes it sound like, well, we're working very hard to stave this off. But in point of fact, that like we're productionists, as I say here. This is I guess some Christopher Browning talks about this. They're productionists, but in point of fact, they're not productionists. They are attritionists. They didn't know what the final goal was, but they didn't want to have many more Jews than they could avoid staying around to be dealt with in the final goal. So this is a good way of dealing with the Jews, weakening the community. And so here I have just laid out for you exactly the conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto that people had to cope with. You can see the major problems have to do with overcrowding and poverty, disease, starvation, and of course, terror. And so this is essentially the situation in the ghetto. So the attrition process was exacerbated by these conditions. And systematic starvation and epidemic disease are in effect the things that are manifestations of this situation. There's very little food coming into the ghetto. The Germans control that. And the overcrowding and the lack of fuel and the lack of sanitation and all the other stuff means that disease rages through the ghetto. And again, here's my death toll. Now, we come to the third part, another part of this policy and procedure, and that is where the ghettos figure in another aspect of the solutions to the Jewish problem. And by here, I mean the total solution. Because with the invasion of the Soviet Union, with the beginnings of the Einsatzgruppen and so on and so forth, be that as it may, somewhere in the context of the invasion of the Soviet Union, something shifts in German policy. Now, in 1941, in the summer of 41, as the Soviet Union is being invaded, where is everybody else? Where are the Jews between June 41 and February of 42, when the deportations start to the death camps? Well, Polish Jews, as we know, are dying by attrition in the ghettos. Soviet Jews are being shot on the Eastern Front by the Einsatzgruppen. In terms of the rest of Europe, West and Central European Jews, the conditions are certainly more dire than they were, but they are still living in a far closer approximation to their pre-war lives than, say, the Jews either in the ghettos or certainly in the Soviet Union. And so they have been made to wear badges. And if you want to have a sense of that, if you read Anne Frank's diary, the parts before she goes into hiding, she gives a very good description of what it was like to live under German occupation in this early stage here, after the invasion of Holland, so 40, 41. So as the Jews in Poland and the Soviet Union are suffering their situational solutions, the Jews in the rest of Europe are still kind of living the life that they sort of kind of lived. Now, but here's what happens. In the summer of 1941, somewhere in, hard to say, late June, early July, Hitler decides to murder all of Europe's Jews. And on July 31st, 1941, Goering gives that job to Heydrich. Remember, Goering was the guy that was appointed to, by Hitler to, deal with the final solution of the Jewish problem. Hitler actually wanted the SS to do it. And so Himmler delegates the work to Heydrich, and Heydrich gets Goering's permission. Goering authorizes Heydrich. And so we know the date of at least the decision had been made by July 31st, 1941. Because what is Goering saying to Heydrich? I herewith commission you to carry out all necessary preparations in regard to the organizational, practical, and material matters for a total solution of the Jewish question, Gesamtlösung der Judenfrage, in the German sphere of influence within Europe. Final solution of the Jewish question. So now we're in a whole other ballgame. So the decision is made, and by November of 1942, they've pretty much come up with how they're going to implement it. They're going to have death camps. They're going to have murder by gas in various ways. They're going to use the railroads. They're going to deport, and then they're going to annihilate them in a specific kind of murder process. And it's only, and finally, in November of 1942, well, actually January 42, the Wannsee Conference ratifies this because Heydrich has a meeting of all the important people who he needs to tell, you have to be on board with this because my goals are going to take precedence. And so he gets the compliance of the key government agencies at Wannsee, and it starts. Now, remember the emigration solution? On October 23rd, 1941, Himmler says it's over. And in the protocol of the Wannsee Conference, that conference called in Berlin in January of 1942 to tell all the honchos that their cooperation is going to be needed, it's made very clear. We no longer are going to emigrate the Jews. Another possible solution of the problem is now taking the place of emigration, i.e. the evacuation, and there's a German word for that, Aussiedlung, and evacuation is one of those nice bureaucratic terms that everyone uses, and everyone understands that that means evacuation to the death camps, deportation to the death camps. In fact, the evacuation east is always a signal. That's one of those great bureaucratic terms, Aussiedlung. No more immigration, now evacuation. Europe will be combed through, he says at the bottom of that paper trail, from west to east. And so systematic genocide with 6 death camps, see them all here, and a very specific, systematic, attenuated deportation process. I said this, if you listen to the Auschwitz, those of you who heard me talk about Auschwitz when I talked about visualizing genocide at the first talk for the Auschwitz exhibit, will remember this. They threw out 4 dragnets, and you can see there's sort of these across 4 circumferences across Europe, dragnets, literally circumferences, and pulled Jews in a systematic way, in relays, if you will, to these death camps. And as far as the Jews we're looking at, the Polish Jews, the Jews of Warsaw, the Jews in the general government, they are really the prime group. They're the largest group. And here you have a quote from Christopher Browning: from mid-March 1942 to February 1943, over 1/2 of the victims of the Jewish Holocaust or Shoah lost their lives. Now, 6 million Jews, half is 3 million. Jews in Poland, 3 million. And the largest group to come to the death camps is group number 2. And those are the groups in the general government, the Polish Jews. The process is very straightforward. They're collected, they are assembled, and they are transported. Various kinds of police units and auxiliaries go to people's homes or go to the ghettos, and where they're living in the ghettos, pull them out of their homes and march them forcibly to assembly points. These assembly points can be train stations. These assembly points can be transit ghettos. They can be transit camps. That varies with different parts of Europe. They wait there, and in relays, they are taken out in freight cars, because that's cost cutting. You can shove more people into a freight car. And taken to the death camps. And I have here just essentially the timing. And the Jews in the ghettos, even though at Wannsee they say from west to east, they actually are combing them from east to west. The Jews in the ghettos and in the general government are the first to go. And in this situation, in spring of 42 and summer of 42 and fall of 42, when the bulk of these Jews are taken out, as Christopher Browning says, by mid-March they're gone. This process here is essentially a very straightforward process. They are taken to the death camps and just about everybody's killed. And the timing, I've written it, you get a sense here of the bulk of the timing and the camps. And again, there are 3 camps particularly, Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka 2, which are the camps for the Jews in the general government. And that operation, the deportation of the Jews in the general government, is called Operation Reinhardt. And this is the operation we're going to be concerned with. So now we come to what you paid your money for, which is the Aktion itself. The Aktion itself. So the Jews are in the Warsaw Ghetto. They are dying by attrition, but they're still there. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, they have developed, like in all the ghettos of long standing, because by 1942, they've been in the ghetto 2 years. They've developed a way of living. It's a very arduous way of living. It's fraught with death, as I pointed out, terrible conditions, but they're living. They're living in sort of apartments, you know, maybe crammed in many, many families. They've got some of their families with them. There's a semblance, a kind of, I can't think of the right word, an avatar of life, if you will. And this is true not just in Warsaw, it's true in Lublin, it's true in Przemysl, it's true all over the area, all over the general government. You name a city, Krakow, where Schindler's List takes place, so on and so forth, Białystok. So what has happened here? In March and April of 1942, something happens in the Warsaw Ghetto that shifts everything for people who are starting to look at these things, especially the diarist, Adam Chernyakov talks about it. First of all, in March of 1942, there are major deportations from Lublin. They take place across Passover, as I point out here. So March 16th to April 14th, the bulk of Jews in the Lublin ghetto are deported to Belzec, the first of the 3 Operation Reinhardt death camps. Obviously, the news doesn't filter its way to Warsaw, much as, you know, the Germans try to keep a lid on the news gets there. And people don't understand what's going on. And there's a great deal of rumor. That's prelude piece 1. Prelude piece 2 happens in the ghetto itself. And that is on Friday and Saturday, April 17th and 18th. There's something called the Night of Blood. German trucks descend on the ghetto with armed SS and members of the Jewish police service. They round up a list. They have a hit list of 60 people, of which they find 52, and they kill them. It's called the Night of Blood. And this throws everybody for a loop. Now, it isn't they're not suffering from a certain amount of terror. Terror is very endemic in the ghetto. As Arkadiusz Gahan, my former thesis advisor years ago at Chicago, once said to me, and actually writes in one of his essays, and he talks about the Vilna ghetto, but it's the same difference. He said, you know, people, their loved ones would go off to work in the morning, and you wouldn't be sure you're going to see them at night. So it isn't that kind of thing. But there was a semblance of life, a semblance of some kind of ordinary daily routine, whatever. Suddenly, in the perception of the people in the ghetto, this has been ripped away from them. And as Marek Edelman says, until that day, no matter how difficult life had been, the ghetto inhabitants felt that their everyday life, the very foundation of their existence, was based on something stabilized and durable. On April 18th, the very basis of ghetto life started to move from under people's feet. Now, he says by now everybody understood the ghettos to be liquidated, but nobody realized the entire population was destined to die. I put that in red because I think it's interesting. I'm not sure what entirely to make of it, but I think it's interesting that he's riffing off this notion that suddenly the earth seemed to have been pulled out from under people's feet. Now, Adam Chernyakov is no slouch. He goes to see Heinz Auerswald, who's the head of the ghetto. You know, the German commandant, we mentioned him before. Heinz Auerswald, who is the commissar of the ghetto. And he says to him, what is going on? What was all this about? Why were you killing these people? And members even of the Judenrat, as he points out in his diary, are also, you know, they have their answers. They go and try to talk. He speaks to another person, Brandt. And what's interesting here, yes, he sometimes speaks to Auerswald, but most of the time he really is fobbed off with these fairly low level members of KDS section of the Gestapo section. KDS means a command of police leaders, SS and police leaders. And he's not talking to the highest people. Every so often, maybe Auerswald once or twice, but the people he talks to are always telling him the same thing. Brandt and, you know, other people are always telling him, don't worry about it. Nothing's going on. And what does Brandt say? He says, well, the people we killed were printers. And what do I mean by printers? They were running underground presses, which are not only forbidden, they're capital offenses. You get killed right away for them. So we were just doing it to these, you know, bad apples, these people who are radical and, you know, whatever. Now that they're done, that's it. And now if they come back, we'll get even more severe. But basically, it's the underground papers. And notice the other people on the Judenrat say the same thing. It's just the underground papers that do untold harm to the Jewish population. And what's interesting is here is Auerswald's summary of it in a memo. And he goes, message from the head of the Jewish Council in the afternoon of April 17th of this year, rumors spread in the ghetto that some kind of Aktion was to be expected. Some grocery stores then closed their shops. During the night, the security police carried out an action, that's the Aktion, in which about 50 people were shot. And now it's over. So he's reporting. Okay. But fast forward to July of 1942, and now it starts. From July 15th on, certain preparations are made that do and don't come to the attention of various people in the Judenrat and the Jewish community. And we start with SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Höfler. Now, he is a very important person. He comes from Lublin. He works for Odilo Globachnik, who is the head of the SS for the entire general government, and very much the head of Operation Reinhardt. And Hermann Höfler, and Sturmbannführer is a fairly high rank. Hermann Höfler comes to, he is the Operation Reinhardt, what shall I say? He heads the, he runs the deportations for Operation Reinhardt. And so he arrives in Warsaw. And he brings with him an Aussiedlungsstab, a resettlement staff, Aussiedlung, evacuation, resettlement, of some 20 SS who've been doing this with him. This is his group. He brings a staff with him, and he's going to be running the deportations from the Warsaw ghetto. And in Warsaw, he commandeers two buildings. One becomes his command post, his Befehlsstelle on Zalazny Street, and one, they take over the headquarters of the Jewish police, the Jüdische Ordnungsdienst, the Jewish police service. And there they put people that have been in Warsaw the whole time, and people that have been working with the Warsaw SS police. Now, they start a few roundups on July 17th, German Jews. They are forced out of the synagogue where they were living. Foreign Jews are rounded up. Foreign Jews meaning Jews with non-Polish citizenships. And Chernyakov is, beginning to worry. On July 18th, in his diary, he notes, in the morning with Jakob Lakin, who is the head of the Jewish police, I go to Brandt and Menda, again, these two guys in the office they've always been dealing with of the SS. and a day filled with forebodings. Rumors that the evacuations and deportations will start on Monday evening, July 20th. Of everybody? I asked the commissioner if he had any information about this, and he said, no, I don't believe it. This is going to be a typical response. Now, this is a little bit of real estate, just to show you the different buildings I've been talking about. For example, here is where the SS Befehlstelle was. Where is it? Number 10. This is where the SS, this is where Huffler sets up his command post. This is, let me find number 17, number 2, 17 Ogrodova Street, sorry. This is where the Jewish police service is, and also where the local SS now come into work. And here's the Jewish community. This is where the Chernyakov's office is, and here are the large and small ghettos. Okay. Sunday, July 19th. Now here we have to go back and think about Himmler. On July 19th, as all this is going on, Himmler orders Friedrich Wilhelm Kruger to carry out the resettlement, Umsiedlung, of the whole Jewish population of the general government by December 31st, 1942. Now it's already in process, but this is a pronouncement that concretizes it. So here is Himmler's order, and here's Adam Chernyakov's diary. And he talks about this because now he is saying the city is filled with unimaginable panic. Different members of the Judenrat are, I'm sorry, not to, but other people who seem to know people in the SS, basically underworld leaders who have connections, are spreading all these rumors about railroad cars coming and so on and so forth. Because of the panic, I drove through the streets of the entire quarter. And so there's, again, people are starting to have rumors of deportations. And notice Himmler has made these orders. The entire Jewish population, and here are the measures that are required for the ethnic divisions of races, and yada, yada, yada. Now, on July 20th, again from the diary of Adam Chernyakov, he goes in, and this is amazing. You know, hopefully you can come back and read this. I know that it's going to be it's being recorded, so I know there'll be a link to it, and you might want to come back and just look at this document. He goes to the Gestapo at 7:30 in the morning, and by Gestapo he really means those people he's been dealing with all the time. Menda, Bohm, and a whole bunch. I have a whole laundry list here. He's been dealing with them all the time, and they're not very high level. And he goes, keeps asking, it goes from one to the other. Hopefully somebody will give him an answer. And everybody says, no, nothing's happening. I don't know what you're talking about. I asked Gerhard Menda how much truth there was in the rumors of deportation, and he said, uncertain. I went to his chief, right? I'm going to the manager, Commissar Bohm. He told me not his department. Gottlieb Hermann, maybe he'll say something. So he says, maybe this other guy will say something. Hermann said, nah. If something would have happened, I'd surely know about it. And this goes on and on. Just read through this. He gets the total runaround. Very bland denials. Now, what's interesting here is many of these people who'd been working in the ghetto the whole time and call themselves productionists and nutritionists and who knows what all, and who seemed to be involved in maintaining the ghetto one way or another, even if it was by attrition, really shift on a dime. And now that the orders are, as they well know, and you will see in the next two slides, that the Jews are to be deported from the Warsaw ghetto, what you have here is these people now turn on a dime and become basically implementers of this policy of deportation to death camps, to systematic genocide. So they go from a situational solution to the total solution on a dime. And the thing Browning points out, these are young men, as I've said. They are ambitious young men. They're not particular fanatics. Then, you know, they don't want, you know, they're not there with blood in their teeth for Jews, but they definitely buy into the policy in a kind of, you know, bland way. And they work to set up the ghettos. And now when they're told they have to destroy the ghettos, they're fine with that too. So their duty now, as he says, is in a different direction. And here's another one of these young men. He's a little bit older than the average young man. But he's younger than Hitler by at least 10 years. Well, less than 10 years, 8 years. Okay. So on Tuesday, July 21st, Erev Tisha B'Av, Adam Chernyakov writes in his diary, I was told by the SS officers of this SS unit to detain in my office all the Judenrat members who are now in the building, because we're going to take them as hostages. They even wanted his wife. Now, some of them are freed, but what's interesting here is that this is the eve of what's going to be happening. I decided to stay, I'm sorry, it's the Erev Tisha B'Av. And there are some seizures and some hostage taking in the Jewish community, because these people are going to be held as the, what shall I say, bargaining chips for the deportation. And so he decided to stay at the community much later than usual to see what's going on. Some get freed, but that being said, it's very clear that something is in the air. And now we come to it. On July 22nd, 1942, he writes 1940. That's how agitated he is. He's back in the community at 7:30. The ghetto has been surrounded. He writes a small ghetto. In fact, the whole ghetto has been surrounded. Hermann Hoffler now comes. Hoffler, the big guy from Lublin, Odilo Globachnik's honcho, comes at 10 o'clock, disconnects the phone, sends away the children from the playground, and we are told that all the Jews, irrespective of sex and age, with certain exceptions, will be deported to the east. By 4 p.m., a contingent of 6,000 people must be provided, and this, at the minimum, will be the daily quota. And so, again, he got the release of his hostages, and basically, at 5:30, one of the officials, his name is in forward, it's a different name. He's so, what's the word? Probably so concerned, so agitated that he writes the wrong name, but it's Vorthoff, drove in and demanded Joseph Ehrlich should be named Leitman's deputy. So essentially, the SS is taken over. Sturmbannführer Hoffler, in charge of deportation, asked me into his office and informed me that for the time being, my wife was free, but if the deportation was impeded in any way, she would be the first one shot as a hostage. Now, Mary Berg, who writes a very interesting diary, she's a young woman. In her diary, she notes, today the ghetto had a bloody Wednesday. The misfortune everyone expected has struck. At daybreak, patrols of Lithuanians and Ukrainians led by elite guards surrounded the ghetto, and armed guards were stationed every 10 yards. So the ghetto is surrounded by armed forces, mostly SS, along with Lithuanian, Latvian, and Ukrainian auxiliaries. And here's a picture of some of the auxiliaries here. This was taken actually during the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. I couldn't get any pictures of auxiliaries earlier than that, but this is what they kind of looked like. They're wearing old SS coats. Now here's what happens. Hoffler comes to the Judenrat, and Adam Chernyakov in the previous diary entry for that day is kind of terse about what happens. But Hoffler tells the Judenrat, here are his orders. He gives them certain orders. The Judenrat, and he reads it to them. The Judenrat is informed of the following. All Jewish persons living in Warsaw, regardless of age and sex, will be resettled in the East. And then more things here in terms of who might be exempt from immediate resettlement. And again, resettlement is Umsiedlung, resettlement. That's, again, one of those nice bland words. Aussiedlung, evacuation, Umsiedlung, resettlement. All Jewish persons, so they have a list here, and you can go through this, as to who won't be taken right away. and their relatives and so on and so forth. The resettlement will begin at 11 o'clock on July 22nd, 1942. So just a few hours after he meets with them at 7:30 in the morning. And in the course of the resettlement, the Judenrat will have the following tasks, for the precise execution of which the members of the Judenrat will answer with their lives. No messing about. And here we have another aspect of it, which is to say that the Jewish police, the Jüdische Ordnungsdienst, also has their marching orders. They were to serve as the executive order of the Judenrat responsible for carrying out the deportations. So they were to help bring the people to the deportation situation. Now, you saw what Höfle says to the Judenrat. This is again mimicked in an announcement that is posted all over the ghetto in Polish and in German. German on top, Polish on bottom, and essentially it's the same announcement. And notice it is given in the name of the Judenrat of Warsaw. They originally wanted Czerniaków to sign this himself, to say it was in his name. He said he wouldn't do it. So they put it in. So again, when these orders go up, they're not the SS or the Germans or whoever or the authorities, but the Judenrat is ordering this. And the next day, Czerniaków kills himself. He goes to, as he points out, he goes again to the community, talks to Vortov, that's the right name, another honcho over there. He discussed several problems. They talk about who more, he's trying to get more people exempted. Not the children, though. He doesn't get the children exempted. When he asked how many days a week I'm going to have to do this, he goes, he's told 7 days a week. This is going to go on every day, 24/7. So it's 3 o'clock, 4,000 people are ready to go, and we need to have 9,000 by 4 o'clock. And so Czerniaków goes back to the, he stays late in his office. He writes his final diary entry. You've just looked at it. He writes 2 notes, one to his wife. They demand me to kill children of my nation with my own hands. I have nothing left to do but to die. And he writes a somewhat longer note to the members of the Judenrat. I just can't do this. And he takes cyanide and dies. He is buried on the following day. But his replacement is chosen that evening. Mark Lichtenbaum, not even a man of his stature, essentially, a person of certainly the deputy chairman of the Judenrat, who basically the Germans ignore from then on. They basically just, he doesn't exist for them. He's simply there, and he's eventually shot in April of 1943 during the ghetto uprising. So a new head is chosen. Czerniaków is buried on the 24th. A very small grave marker marks his grave. A much more elaborate one is put up after the war. But he's buried in the Jewish cemetery, which is at the northwestern end of the ghetto. It's a very small, the Germans don't want a lot of publicity. They don't want more panic to start, basically. And his grave is marked by this little stone. Eventually, when his wife dies after the war, she is buried in the much larger grave right next to him. But this is his grave marker. Mary Berg again talks about Adam Czerniaków and how he committed suicide. He could no longer bear his terrible burden. The community elected a new chairman, and a new group of hostages was taken from the Council of Elders and put in prison again, subsequent to coming up with the numbers. And so it starts. And the process is pretty straightforward. And it's the process that you're going to see if you look at any other set of deportations, not just from the ghettos, but also from other aspects of the Holocaust, other parts of Europe. But basically what you have here is, again, as I said, on Wednesday, July 22nd, the Germans surround the ghetto with their auxiliaries. On Thursday, Tisha B'Av, so Wednesday's Erev Tisha B'Av, on Thursday, Tisha B'Av, Czerniaków kills himself, and gassing begins at Treblinka because the first shipment of Jews has arrived. And then you have another here on Wednesday, July 29th, in order to encourage people to volunteer. until the 31st, well, until August 4th, they start giving people bread and marmalade to get people to volunteer to go to the deportation. Later in August, a second train shuttle is ordered, and you can read through this chronology. I'm going to go through some of it again with you as in the last few slides, because there isn't a lot left. Here I have 3 diary entries for the 22nd of July, all basically by the 3 different diarists I've used apart from Chernyakov. Mary Berg, A Bloody Wednesday, Adam Lewin or Levin, also A Day of Turmoil, Chaos, and Fear. The expulsion is supposed to begin today, and there is also talk of an evacuation of the hospital. Beggar children are being rounded up. And you can see where their thoughts are. And they are panic-stricken. And they don't know quite what to do, because what the Germans do is they go through this ghetto block by block, cordoning off the blocks and pulling people out and then leaving, and people who are left in the other blocks think, well, maybe it's over. People just don't know what is happening because the Germans don't give them a game plan. He's thinking what to do to help his mother. Maybe he should report. Maybe he shouldn't. Maybe he should send her. He doesn't know. And Chaim Kaplan, he's very interesting. He talks about, I haven't the strength to hold a pen. I've never seen anything like this. A whole community of 400,000 people are going to be condemned to die. Now, again, how's this executed? Transports of 5,000 to 7,000 and then eventually 10,000 people a day leave daily for Treblinka too. As I said earlier, nonstop violence and terror. People are collected on the streets. The streets are cordoned off systematically. They call these operations kettles. They cordon off a street and it's a kettle or a pot. And all the people in it are people in the kettle. And the inhabitants are marched through the streets. They are assembled at the Umschlagplatz, which is essentially, it's basically the area in front of the Gdansk railway station, the Warsaw-Danzig railway station. Umschlagplatz means transfer point, and it was called the transfer point by the Jews because originally right near it was something called the Transferstelle, where the food coming into the ghetto would come. So that was why this name transfer was taken. And then they're, of course, crammed into railroad cars and taken to Treblinka. And here again, you have some excerpts from different diaries that give you a sense, from Lewin's diary, that give you a sense of how this works. And the chaos that ensues, people trying to save themselves in whatever way they can. Here's the diary of Chaim Kaplan. Again, thousands of people in the Nalevki Zemenhof block were driven from their homes and taken to the transfer point, the Umschlagplatz. If my life ends, what will become of my diary? This is his last entry. Now, these pictures I'm showing you are interesting too. I was looking for pictures for a long, long time. These are the only pictures there are. There are very few, there's lots of pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto, all kinds of pictures of life in the ghetto, hundreds and hundreds, Germans and Jews and whatnot. But very few pictures of these actions, of the big action. These are the pictures. I mean, these are all there are. And in some cases, you know, they're not even captioned properly. You don't even know what street they're on. But these give you a sense of the chaos. On an earlier slide, you know, Abraham Lewin talks about turmoil and chaos. This is what we're looking at here. Here's more of it. And then they're taken to the Umschlagplatz. And the Umschlagplatz is interesting. As I said, it was created by, they basically, here's the train station. Here it is, okay? And now it's sort of bigger here. And the people, when you see them waiting, this is the waiting area. Eventually, this is sort of incorporated into the waiting area too. And this is where you come in. And here in this area, people coming in, there's only one entrance to the Umschlagplatz on Jika Street, I should say. And what you have here, this area is the area where a certain amount of, quote, selection takes place. Sometimes people are pulled out of these lines of people going towards the platform in the waiting area. And here are the rails, okay? And sent back into the ghetto to do some kind of slave labor or whatever. So you have, you know, you have a waiting area in the south, you have a a loading area in the north. And so here here's north. So here are the trains. So the waiting area and then the loading area. People are taken to the trains. They come in here. The selections are here, such as they are. And then they are waiting and then they are loaded on the trains. Interestingly, very much like the pedestrians going back and forth, you know, under the ghetto, under that footbridge and, you know, outside the ghetto wall, the rest of the train station continues to function like a train station. And the thing about the Umschlagplatz is these pictures, as you're going to see, are very mild looking. And my sense is Germans took these pictures because they look very not like how arduous the situation was, how fraught. There was screaming, there was shooting, there were people trying to save themselves. There was a great deal of corruption. If you paid huge bribes to Jewish policemen, sometimes you could get away. Women sometimes paid with their bodies, or to Latvian and Ukrainian auxiliaries. Sometimes you could get away. They'd let you go back in. If you've seen the film The Pianist, I have some problems with it, but the scenes in the Umschlagplatz are pretty good. And remember, there's a scene where his friend, a Jewish policeman, literally pulls him out of the line going to the train to Treblinka and saves him in that regard. That's the kind of situation that obtained. But what I get from reading descriptions of the Umschlagplatz is that it was an incredibly fraught place with a lot of violence that we don't really see in these pictures. Here are some of the women, well, actually women and men, who were given as I said, bread and marmalade as an inducement to go to the Umschlagplatz, because after a while people weren't going or weren't trying to, you know, run away. And here you have them eating their bread. But you get a little bit of sense of the turmoil, just the expressions of the women in the upper picture, but nothing. This looked very calm. By the way, this is a school building, which is still a school building, that was used as one of the holding areas. So people were not only waiting in the Umschlagplatz itself, but also taking shelter in these then not being used school buildings. And then they're put on trains. And here again, we come to something fascinating, because the trains, they run like trains. It's the Ostbahn, which is the eastern branch of the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Ostbahn means the east train. The Deutsche Reichsbahn has now expanded across all of Festung Europa. And, you know, it's completely in control of occupied Europe. And it's a profit-making organization. The SS actually has to pay them. That's why you have the freight cars to cram people in, because it's cheaper. There's a whole fare structure, which I'm not going to go into at this point, but it definitely is there. In any case, on August 6th, they put on a second train. They call them shuttles. And so this is a schedule, a waybill for waybill number 5 timetable, number 548 for the second train that's put on. So there used to be only one shuttle going to Treblinka every day. Then they put on a second one. And this is a very nice looking, again, a paper trail document. Everything is done in triplicate, explaining exactly the times they're leaving. So they leave Warsaw, the Warsaw Gdansk station, which is to say from the Umschlagplatz. They go to Malkinia, which is one stop, and to Treblinka. So there are 5 station stops outbound: Warsaw, Marki, another suburb, Malkinia, Treblinka. And then they come back and they give you the back. And what's interesting too, from August 6, 1942 until further notice, a special train, and if you heard me talk about when I did the Auschwitz talk, visualizing genocide, I said that the word special, a Sonderzug is what this is called, always refers to genocide, Jews. A Sonderzug is a special train with a special purpose taking them to Treblinka to kill them. So here's your Sonderzug, nice bland term. It's going to, and look what it says. It's really quite chilling when you read it, but it's very kind of like, you know, laid out there nicely. Will run a special train with resettlees. I didn't know there's no actual English word like that. Umsiedlern are people who have been resettled. Umsiedlung. Again, another nice bland bureaucratic term. Will run daily from the Warsaw Gdansk station to Treblinka, and an empty train will return. And here's the schedule. With the times and the type of rolling stock. And the convoy sizes are, you know, again, it's a very straight. And here's the other thing too. These pictures, again, I always figured Germans took these pictures because there's nothing fraught about these pictures. People seem to be walking, you know, fairly, you know, in some orderly fashion to the trains. But in fact, again, the loading process was hugely fraught. There were guns involved, there were dogs involved, there was shooting over people's heads. People were killed there. In fact, people were killed in the Umschlagplatz as well. People were taken out of the Umschlagplatz if they were elderly or infirm and shot, or little children, and they were killed in the Jewish cemetery and buried in mass graves. So again, you don't get that sense from these pictures. And there are very few pictures of the Umschlagplatz and even fewer pictures of people boarding the train specifically to Treblinka. And it's a 3 or 4 hour trip that could take more than a day, largely because priority is given to military transports going to and from the Eastern Front. And also there's a great deal of gridlock that occurs at Treblinka with so many Jews coming in, not just from Warsaw, but other areas. They sometimes delay them as they get to the camp and keep them in the train for a day or overnight. So they're not, although the train trip should take 3 to 4 hours, it often takes a lot longer. And even when they get there, they usually take them out in relays. They divide the train in 3 at a rail ramp about 4 kilometers away, and they send the train in section by section. And then the empty train, Leerzug, as they say, empty train, goes back. And so, my epilogue. Final count. Around 300,000 Jews are sent to Treblinka. Most are killed. Again, this isn't like that attenuated process of the Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz, where there's a selection process to send to slave labor and so on. That doesn't happen at Treblinka. In the ghetto, in the course of this action, about 35,000 are killed. Some Jews are sent to transit camps to do other kinds of work. They're selected out at the Umschlagplatz, about 12,000, 11,500. Some flee to the Aryan side. And after all is said and done, between 70 and 80,000 people remain in the ghetto. That's it. That's all that were left. On January 18th, 1943, the SS come back and the police units to start another deportation process. This time, the Jews are a little less obliging in a sense. And I'm putting that in quotes because they were never obliging to start with. But a lot of Jews responded at that point by having dug into bunkers in the period between the end of the Action on September 21st and the new Action they were hoping to begin on January 18th. So they were trying to do that. The other thing that happened was a few of the armed groups, a small group of armed responders with a few weapons that they'd smuggled into the ghetto, fired on the Germans. So the Germans got about 5,000 Jews and then they left. On April 19th, they come back again in full force. They are met with slightly more armed response than they were. And for a while, they are kept out of the ghetto, but that armed response is not sustainable. And in the end, the ghetto is obliterated. And by the time Warsaw is liberated, there are only about 174,000 people left in the city altogether, and only 11,500 Jews. Venomala Warschau, there once was a Warsaw. And here again is Mark Edelman. We didn't choose it. There are only 220 of us left. We chose how we would die. And my final word comes from the diary of Hillel Seidman. And he was a very traditionally observant Jew. And I like his riff on it because he has a very good sense always in his diary of a traditional point of view, but also a sense of history that is fascinating. In retaliation for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, at the end of the uprising, the Germans dynamite the great synagogue on Tolmatsky Street, which was when it was built in 1878, when it was dedicated, it was considered the largest synagogue in the world. It was a great symbol of Polish Jewry, both traditional and historical. And that's the ruins of it. And he writes, and I love it. If you look at it, I won't read the whole thing. It's a wonderful quote. But what he talks about is we should have a new Wailing Wall. If after the war, you go to Jerusalem, you know, there's the Wailing Wall, the Kotel Maravi, the Western Wall, that wall of the temple, the remaining wall of the temple. He said, you should bring a stone from Nalewki. Nalewki was like the heart of the Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw. The Jewish community building was near there. The Talmudsky synagogue was near there. It was all, you know, all that was there. He said, we should bring a stone to commemorate the Jews of Warsaw, the extinction of a central powerhouse in Judaism. And we should mourn it as our own personal Korban, the way we mourn the Korban of the Holy Temple. And that's it. Thank you for paying attention and hanging in there with me. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that in-depth look at ghettos and the deportation. We have a few questions for you. And if anyone else has questions, feel free to put them there in the Q&A and I can formulate them. Firstly,
wait a second, hang on. What am I doing wrong here?
Oh, just hit stop share.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Just a moment. Bear with me a moment. Okay, stop share. Got it. There we are.
There we go. Perfect. So firstly, maybe if you could give us a little bit of insight onto when these deportations started from various ghettos across Poland, how it was decided which of the killing centers they would be sent to.
Well, actually, it really has to do with which are operational. And so the way it started was Belzec was the first one, the first of the 3 Operation Reinhardt camps that was online, so to speak. And so the first deportations go there. The second sets of deportations go to Sobibor, and the third sets go to Treblinka, because Treblinka is essentially the third of the 3 Operation Reinhardt camps online. From there on, it really has to do with what's available, what kind of personnel is available, and also where the bottlenecks are. As I pointed out, the murder process is hampered by the fact that they have so many people they have to kill at any given time. And they also can't get rid of them, bury the bodies, because they're not always cremating them. For Treblinka especially, it's a real problem. They don't have crematoria right away. They're burying them in mass grave, and that sets up a huge problem. And they can't bury them fast enough, so they don't have people to work, you know, the gas machinery, if you will. And so basically, it becomes a kind of, it's not a systematic problem in some geographic way, though, that you can talk about certain camps. If you look at the map, certain camps are in the location of certain ghettos, and they're built for those districts. But later on, I mean, you see them sending Dutch Jews to Sobibor. It really depends on the time and what's available. It's a practical situation. It's an eminently practical issue. It's pragmatic problems.
Thank you. And what about the dates in terms of the when the Germans decided to start these deportations, having often falling on a holiday, or speak to that?
I don't know. You know, I spent a long time thinking about that. I've heard survivors go, well, you know that, and again, all due respect to survivors, they are allowed to, you know, they get to say what they need to say, and it's their experience. But, you know, as a historian, you have to put together everything you hear, and you hear them saying things like, well, you know that they knew when it was Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and they would burn more people, they would gas more people. I have a sense that on some levels, some of these dates are chosen, again, for practical reasons, and it just comes out that way. Other sense is, too, that there is a sense of, what's the right word? There's a psychological component to doing this. It's like doing something very negative in a very positive situation. And so it screws with the mindset, basically, and it puts people at more of a disadvantage. Now, if you're a traditionally observant Jew, this really can throw you. And so there, and there was this fantasy too in German ideology of how all Jews are really all, part of this bizarre, mystic, crazy religion. And so that could be it too. So I think there's something to the symbolism, but I don't think we should pay a lot of attention, but it's very useful in some ways.
In terms of numbers, when we're talking about, actual soldiers, Jewish police, those that are used during the deportations, do we have any, rough numbers or percentages in terms of like, what would the ratio of those enforcing the deportation to those being deported look like?
I don't have numbers at hand. I can't, but looking at the visual evidence, they're very small forces. They're not very big. They're not hundreds and hundreds. For example, I never see more than 40 or 50 members of the Warsaw Ghetto Police Force for the Jewish police. The thing I found interesting about this, and this is true not just in Warsaw, but in other ghettos as well, people who volunteer, and people volunteer for this service. You're not dragooned into it. And volunteer for it in terms of they can get something for it. Their families have a better deal. And as I pointed out on one of the timelines, there is a point where Jewish policemen are exempt and their families are exempt. And then, of course, their families aren't exempt, at least not their mothers or fathers, but only their families, their nuclear families. And then, of course, they have to bring 5 people, and it becomes a very hard task. But that being said, what's interesting is people who first go into the Jewish police are lawyers. There's a preponderance of lawyers. I came across this, which really threw me. But when you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. The notion of law enforcement and so on and so forth. I'm not casting aspersions on lawyers. I have some in my family, near and dear. But the point is that it's interesting to me as a choice. And again, we have to see in terms of response to how to survive this situation. So as a survival mechanism, when we say Jews don't respond because they don't resist with arms, that's nonsense. They all tried to stay alive, and this was one way.
And for those, young men, officers that you're talking about in the Nazis, did they, to what extent did they understand the final solution that they were a part of?
Oh, I think they understood it fine. I mean, and again, many of them are lawyers. In fact, I came across a number of them that are called Dr. this and Dr. that. And I saw they're also lawyers. I realized that's a title for a lawyer. It's Dr. So-and-so. That's not true in other cultures in Europe, but for the German,
Have a brief tech issue. We'll see if we can get her back. I think we may have lost Dr. Sternberg here. Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening here for this presentation. We hope to see you in our future ones as well. The recording of this presentation will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the next few days. So if you'd like to revisit some of the concepts that you saw here, she's back here for a moment.
I lost my connection. No, unfortunately it happens from time to time.
Well, I was just, thanking everyone for being here, and of course, thanking you for this wonderful presentation. We certainly learned a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. It was actually, I learned a great deal from it myself, so I appreciate the opportunity, and the best to all of you. Thank you.
Have a good night.